What happens when 5 nights of complete silence suddenly explode into the biggest single night of bombing this war has ever seen? That is exactly what just happened. And once you understand the full scale of it, you will see why analysts across the world are calling it a turning point. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of how the United States just launched one of the largest strike packages of the entire war across 5 Iranian provinces and 3 islands in a single night, hit that like button right now, because understanding this means understanding why the rules of this conflict have just changed. Subscribe if you want to follow this war as it actually unfolds with the kind of grounded analysis you will not find anywhere else. And send this to someone who still thinks this conflict is winding down, because what just happened proves otherwise. For 5 straight nights, there was nothing. No strikes, no missiles, no explosions lighting up the night sky over the Gulf. After months of non-stop fighting, that kind of silence felt strange. It felt almost hopeful. People across the region who had been living under the constant threat of war finally let themselves breathe a little. Analysts started using words like de-escalation. Officials quietly hinted that maybe, just maybe, this brutal conflict was finally running out of steam. Then Iran fired ballistic missiles at an American base in Jordan. And within about 24 hours, the United States answered with a response so large it dwarfed almost everything that came before it. Explosions tore through 5 separate Iranian provinces and 3 islands. In the Persian Gulf, all within the same night. A senior American official described this strike package in blunt terms, saying it was roughly twice the size of the previous major wave of attacks. But once you actually look at the list of targets that got hit, the comparison almost feels like an understatement. This was not a small symbolic retaliation. This was a message written in fire across an entire stretch of southern Iran. And it changed the shape of this war overnight. To understand why this moment matters so much, we need to rewind and look at how we even got here. Because this war did not start last week. It did not start with the missile attack on Jordan either. This conflict has been grinding on for months, and every single escalation has been building toward moments exactly like this one. Back in late February, the United States and Israel launched a massive coordinated campaign against Iran. In just the opening days, American forces struck more than 5,000 separate targets across the country. They damaged or destroyed 50 Iranian naval vessels. That operation alone reshaped Iran's entire military posture before the war was even 2 weeks old. It set the tone for everything that followed. Neither side from that very first week showed any real interest in slow, careful escalation. Both sides jumped straight to overwhelming force whenever tensions boiled over, and that pattern has repeated itself again and again ever since. Since then, the war has moved through a punishing, exhausting cycle. Strikes, ceasefires that never quite held, agreements signed on paper and then broken within. Weeks. Naval blockades imposed, eased, and imposed again as both sides tested exactly how far they could push before the other side snapped back. Each phase of this war has looked slightly different on the surface, but underneath, the same basic rhythm keeps repeating. Pressure, pause, and then pressure again. Each time a little heavier than the last. By the middle of summer, one particular ceasefire had become what a lot of commentators started calling a ceasefire in name only. Iran kept interfering with shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran kept launching attacks even after formally agreeing to stop. So the United States restarted strikes on Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and the fragile quiet that had briefly settled over the region collapsed almost as fast as it had appeared. And then against all odds, something rare happened. 5 nights passed without a single new strike. Now, 5 nights might not sound like much on paper, but you have to picture what those 5 months before it actually looked like. Nearly constant combat, explosions as a kind of background noise, families going to sleep not knowing if their city would be hit that night. Against that backdrop, 5 quiet nights in a row felt enormous. It felt like maybe finally exhaustion was winning out over aggression on both sides. People started to breathe a little easier. Markets started to settle. For just a moment, it felt like this war might be entering its final stretch. That is exactly why what happened next hit so hard. There was no slow buildup. No smaller strikes testing the waters. First, just silence, then a missile attack on American troops. Then, within about a day, explosions ripping across an area of southern Iran large enough to span 4 provinces and 3 islands all at the same time. That kind of sudden shift from a hopeful pause straight into one of the largest strike waves of the entire war tells you something important. It tells you how much tension was still sitting just beneath the surface. Even during those quiet nights, the calm was never really peace. It was a held breath. And when that breath finally broke, it broke violently. If you are finding this breakdown valuable, drop a like right now and share this video with anyone trying to understand the real scale of what just happened. This is the kind of context that completely changes how you see the news. So let us talk about what actually happened when the United States decided it was, in President Trump's own words, our turn. At around 10 at night, Eastern Time, Central Command announced it had completed what officials called a heavy wave of strikes against Iran. The operation wrapped up around 5 the next morning. A U.S. official told reporters that the scale of that single night's bombing was roughly double the size of the previous major strike package. When you actually break down the target list, that assessment holds up completely, and in some ways, it even undersells what happened. Central Command's own statement described the operation as wide, extensive, and deeply impactful. It said American forces struck dozens of Revolutionary Guard targets in a single night that included military command centers, missile and drone storage facilities, coastal defense systems and surveillance sites, and naval vessels belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. This was not a narrow surgical strike against one single target. This was a sweeping campaign built to hit nearly every major category of Iranian military power all at once across a massive stretch of territory in a single night. Think about the geography here for a second. Explosions were reported in Hormuz, Khuzestan, Fars, and Bushehr provinces. On top of that, strikes hit the islands of Keshem, Kish, and Abu Musa. Iranian state media reported explosions specifically in the cities of Bushehr, Avaz, and Kazarun, along with hits on Kish Island and Keshem Island, which happens to be the largest island in the entire Persian Gulf. A deputy security official in Khuzestan told Iranian state broadcasters that American forces had struck power infrastructure in the region. Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency reported power outages in Avaz, a city sitting right at the heart of Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. Khuzestan is not just another province on a map, it is home to a huge share of Iran's actual oil production. Any disruption to power and command systems there carries economic weight that reaches far beyond the immediate military target list. And it is the kind of detail that tends to get lost in the noise of casualty counts and province names. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why hit such a wide spread of targets at once instead of concentrating everything on one single high-value site? Think about it like this. If you strike just one command center or just one missile depot, you send a message. But you leave the rest of the country's coastal defenses, naval bases, and command network fully intact and running normally. Spreading the strikes across 4 provinces and 3 islands instead forces Iran's entire southern military system, its coastal defense, its naval bases, its command and control, its drone and missile storage, to absorb damage everywhere at the same time. None of those damaged sites can lean on an undamaged neighbor for backup or support in the chaotic hours right after. That is exactly the kind of comprehensive sweeping damage a military planner reaches for when the goal is not just punishing one provocation. The goal becomes reducing an entire country's capacity to threaten shipping lanes and regional bases for weeks or months to come. Central Command gave a clear, stated purpose for the operation. Officials said the strikes were meant to diminish the threats Iran and its allied groups posed to American forces, to commercial shipping, and to neighboring Gulf nations. That framing tells you this was never purely about punishing Iran for the missile attack in Jordan. It was about tearing down the actual physical infrastructure that gives Iran the ability to threaten shipping lanes and regional bases in the first place. Every command center taken offline is one less node coordinating future attacks. Every missile and drone facility destroyed is one less stockpile that could be launched at American troops or commercial tankers next month. Every coastal radar site knocked out is one more blind spot in Iran's ability to track ships moving through the Strait of Hormuz. This was not retaliation for its own sake. This was a deliberate attempt to reshape what Iran is even capable of doing going forward. Here is where the story stops being about maps and target lists and starts being about real people. Iranian media reported that 3 civilians were killed in the strikes. One of the details that stands out the most, and honestly the hardest one to sit with, comes from Kish Island. A residential building took a direct hit. A couple and their 2-year-old child were killed when the structure they were sheltering in collapsed around them. Separately, Iran's Revolutionary Guard confirmed that 3 of its own personnel had been killed in the American strikes as well. A tragedy on Keshem Island raises hard questions about precision targeting in an operation spread across such a wide area in such a short window of time. Modern precision-guided weapons are remarkably accurate against the coordinates they are given. But accuracy against a coordinate does not erase the deeper risk that comes from hitting military infrastructure, sitting close to, or sometimes inside, residential neighborhoods. Throughout this entire war, both sides have repeatedly placed command centers, storage sites, and defense systems near population centers. Sometimes that is just how a country's infrastructure naturally developed over decades. Sometimes it looks a lot more deliberate. almost like a bet that an enemy will hesitate to strike a target surrounded by homes and families. Whether that calculation played any role in what happened on Kish Island, nobody outside the actual target planning room can say for certain. But the outcome underscores something painfully consistent throughout this entire war. Even the most carefully planned, most extensively verified strike operation still carries real risk to people who had absolutely nothing to do with the military decisions being made around them. A family sheltering in their own home on what should have been an ordinary night. That is the human cost sitting underneath every strategic headline in this war. And it is worth pausing on even for just a moment before we move back into the strategy of it all. At this point, if you're enjoying this deep dive and want to stay updated on how this story develops, make sure you are subscribed. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and join our community of viewers who understand that the real story is always what happens beneath the surface, and Iran's response to all of this was not limited to public statements and mourning. In the hours and days that followed, both Jordan and Kuwait reported Iranian strikes on their own territory. Kuwait confirmed that one person was killed in that exchange. That immediate cross-border retaliation tells you something important about how this war continues to function even after 5 months of brutal grinding attrition. Iran still has enough capability, even after absorbing one of the largest single-strike packages of the entire conflict, to launch attacks against multiple countries within the same general window of time. Degraded is clearly not the same thing as disarmed. The fact that Iran could answer a strike of this scale with its own retaliatory attacks against 2 separate neighboring nations tells you that whatever damage got inflicted that night, Iran's strike network still has real teeth left. That single fact reshapes how we should think about the entire operation. A strike twice the size of anything before it did not end the threat. It did not force Iran into silence. Within days, missiles were landing in 2 other countries entirely, countries that had nothing to do with launching the original attack on Jordan. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this war. Overwhelming force can degrade capability. It has not yet been able to end the will to keep fighting. Now, let us zoom out and look at something buried in this story that deserves a lot more attention than it usually gets. What was left off that target list? In the days leading up to this operation, President Trump made a very specific, very public threat. He promised to destroy Iranian dual-use infrastructure if Iran kept attacking commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Dual-use infrastructure means facilities that serve both civilian and military purposes. Energy sites, ports, economically vital targets. That threat was loud and it was clear, and it was repeated across multiple public statements in the days before the strikes actually happened. And yet, when the actual strikes came, that entire category of target was conspicuously missing. Central Command's list stuck to a fairly traditional military target set: command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal defense systems, naval assets. The dual-use economic infrastructure that Trump had specifically threatened simply was not part of this operation. That gap between the threat and the actual execution tells you something genuinely important about how this war is being managed behind closed doors. It suggests that even after 5 months of escalating rhetoric and increasingly aggressive strike packages, there remains a deliberate, calculated line that nobody wants to cross into direct economic warfare against Iran's civilian-facing infrastructure. That restraint is not an accident. Striking dual-use economic targets carries an enormously higher risk of triggering exactly the kind of full-blown regional war that every neighboring government from Saudi Arabia to the UAE to Kuwait has been desperately trying to avoid getting pulled into. It also risks a global oil price shock that could destabilize economies far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Energy markets are already jittery every time this war escalates. Traders watch every single headline out of the Gulf because even a rumor of an attack on a port or refinery can send oil prices swinging within minutes. So even in a strike wave twice, the size of the one before it, even right after Iran had just tried a surprise missile attack on American troops, Washington still chose to keep this particular line uncrossed. They hit military capability. They spared the economic infrastructure that keeps Iran's government funded and running. There is a pattern hiding inside that decision. And once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere in this war. From the very first days of the opening campaign back in February all the way through this latest heavy wave of strikes, American strategy has consistently drawn the exact same line over and over again. Degrade the military capability that enables aggression while carefully preserving the economic infrastructure that, if destroyed outright, would trigger consequences far harder to walk back from. That is not a coincidence. That is a deliberate, repeated, strategic choice running through nearly every major operation of this entire war. It is a bet that keeping this one door closed preserves enough of an off-ramp for a real negotiated resolution to still be possible someday, no matter how far the military campaign itself continues to escalate. Think about what that restraint actually costs, though. Every time Washington chooses not to hit an oil terminal or port, it is choosing a longer war over a shorter one. A quick, brutal strike on Iran's actual economic lifeline could, in theory, end this conflict far faster by collapsing the government's ability to fund its military at all. But it would also very likely drag Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and half the region into direct economic catastrophe alongside it. So instead, the war grinds on month after month precisely because nobody wants to gamble with that kind of irreversible escalation. Restraint here is not weakness. It is its own form of calculated risk management playing out in real time with real lives on the line. Now let us talk about what it actually takes to pull off an operation this large. Because most people watching the news never stop to think about the sheer scale of coordination required behind a single night like this one. Striking 5 separate provinces and 3 distinct islands within a single operational window, all completed in roughly 7 hours, requires an extraordinary level of planning. Every single target on that list had to be independently verified through satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human intelligence sources on the ground. Military planners needed to confirm not just that a facility existed, but that it was still active, still occupied by real military assets, and not just an empty decoy built to waste an expensive precision weapon. Aircraft and naval assets had to be positioned and timed, so that strikes across such a wide spread of geography could all land within the same tight window. That timing matters enormously. It denies Iranian air defense networks any chance to reposition mobile assets or reinforce one location after watching any attack unfold somewhere else first. Coordinating that kind of operation demands enormous trust and precision between different military branches, all operating at once across a huge stretch of contested airspace and water. Air Force strike packages, Navy assets launching from carriers and destroyers scattered across the Gulf, intelligence analysts working around the clock cross-checking satellite passes against known coordinates. All of it has to line up into one single coherent plan executed within hours instead of days. One mistake, one target confirmed too late or cleared too early, and you either waste a very expensive weapon on an empty site, or worse, you miss a genuine threat that survives to be used against American or Allied forces later. This kind of simultaneous multi-location assault is specifically designed to overwhelm an enemy's ability to react in real time. Hit so many places at once that no single defensive response can protect everything under threat. There is also a psychological dimension to spreading attacks across this many locations at the same time. Instead of spacing them out over several nights, when a country faces a single concentrated strike, it can absorb the damage, assess exactly what was lost, and start planning its response with a fairly clear picture of what still remains intact elsewhere. But when a country instead faces explosions across 5 provinces and 3 islands within the same few hours, that creates a completely different kind of chaos. Military leadership and political leadership are forced to try to assess damage, coordinate a national response, and reassure a frightened public all at the same time, all while regional commands may struggle to even communicate clearly with each other in the immediate aftermath. That is exactly the kind of overwhelming simultaneous pressure a heavy wave strike package is built to create. And it is exactly why that simple line from a U.S. official, roughly twice the size of the previous one, carries so much weight underneath its calm, understated phrasing. As we approach the end of this analysis, if you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer who wants to understand the world beyond the headlines. Drop a like, share this with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. Your engagement keeps this channel going and helps us bring you the context that mainstream media often misses. It is worth pausing here to think about just how enormous the American military presence in the region has become. Because that presence is exactly what makes an operation like this even possible on short notice. Defense officials reported that more than 50,000 American service members spread across bases throughout the Middle East were placed on high alert once this strike wave concluded. 50,000 troops spread across a network stretching from Kuwait to Bahrain to Jordan and beyond, all bracing at the same time for whatever Iran might send back in response. That is the scale of the standing military commitment the United States has maintained in this region for 5 straight months now. And it tells you just how much this war continues to demand in terms of sustained troop presence, logistics, and constant readiness, even during the brief windows when active strikes pause and diplomatic channels reopen. Maintaining that level of readiness is not simply a matter of soldiers standing quietly at their posts, waiting for something to happen. It means air defense crews staying on heightened alert around the clock. Interceptor batteries kept loaded, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Medical teams on standby, prepared for mass casualty scenarios. Logistics chains constantly resupplying fuel, munitions, food, and water to bases scattered across half a dozen countries at once. And behind every single one of those 50,000 service members Is a family back home checking the news anxiously, wondering if tonight is the night their loved one's base becomes the next headline. Sustaining that kind of posture for 5 straight months with no clear end date anywhere in sight places an enormous strain not just on military budgets and equipment, but on the actual human beings carrying out this mission night after night in one of the most heavily militarized, most persistently tense regions on the planet. Now let us step back and look at the diplomatic side of this story, because the picture here is far more complicated than a simple choice between war and peace. Even while this heavy wave of strikes was unfolding, and even in the days right after, there was clear evidence of an active diplomatic track running quietly alongside the military campaign. Just days after this operation, the United States actually announced plans for a fresh round of strikes, only to have President Trump personally announce that they were being called off. According to Trump's own account, both Iran and other Middle Eastern countries had asked him to hold off. Sources indicated Trump had spoken directly with Saudi Arabia's crown prince, who raised specific concerns about how new American strikes could further destabilize the region. That detail matters enormously because it shows that Gulf allies like Saudi Arabia hold genuine tangible influence over how far and how fast Washington is willing to push this campaign. That influence exists precisely because those same allies carry massive economic exposure tied to keeping the Strait of Hormuz open and functioning normally. A military analyst covering the situation put it plainly: Saudi Arabia is economically at risk here, deeply dependent on that strait for the flow of its own oil exports. And that dependence gives Riyadh real leverage over Washington's next moves. Leverage it clearly seems willing to use. Think about how strange that dynamic actually is when you say it out loud. A war between the United States and Iran, and one of the biggest factors shaping how far it goes is a phone call from Saudi Arabia. That is not something you see mentioned enough in the headlines, but it might be one of the single most important details in this entire story. The war is not just being fought on the battlefield. It is being managed, shaped, and occasionally restrained by phone calls happening thousands of miles from any explosion. That back and forth, a heavy wave of strikes one week followed by a canceled operation the next, driven at least partly by Gulf. Allies pumping the brakes tells you something important about the true character of this war as it enters its 6th month. This is not a conflict moving in a straight line toward either total victory or a clean, negotiated peace. It is a war that keeps swinging between genuine escalation and genuine restraint, sometimes within the very same week, shaped as much by economic pressure from regional partners and quiet diplomatic backchannels as it is by the outcome of any single strike package. Iran's own military leadership has been remarkably direct about how they read this entire pattern. The head of Iran's wartime military command publicly warned that the United States is moving at an accelerating pace toward fanning the flames of a full-scale regional war. He accused Washington of using neighboring countries, their resources, and their infrastructure as a shield for its own interests, while at the same time strengthening Israel's broader military position across the region. Whether or not you accept that framing, it tells you exactly how Iran's leadership wants to present this conflict, both to its own population and to the wider region. They are casting themselves as the victim of an expanding, deliberate American campaign, rather than acknowledging their own role in repeatedly attacking shipping and violating agreements that triggered each new round of American strikes in the first place. That messaging strategy from Tehran deserves a closer look because it reveals something consistent running through nearly every phase of this war. Iran's leadership has repeatedly tried to position itself internationally as the party under siege, appealing to regional solidarity and painting Washington's actions as an aggressive campaign of expansion rather than as a series of responses to Iran's own attacks on shipping, on regional bases, and on agreements Tehran itself had signed. That messaging is not really aimed at the United States, which is unlikely to be swayed by it at all. It is aimed at the broader region and at Iran's own domestic population, two audiences where a narrative of resistance and victimhood carries real political value, even when the underlying facts tell a much more complicated story about who actually escalated first at each individual stage of this war. That domestic angle matters more than most coverage gives it credit for. A government fighting a war on this scale for 6 straight months needs its own population to keep believing the fight is justified. Every strike, every casualty, every power outage in a city like Avaz becomes part of a story Tehran tells its own people, a story about resisting outside aggression, rather, than a story about the consequences of repeatedly violating agreements it had already signed. Whether that narrative holds up under the pressure of a war this long and this costly is one of the quieter, less visible battles running underneath everything else happening on the ground. There is also a much bigger historical pattern worth pulling into focus here because this heavy wave strike is not some brand new tactic invented specifically for this moment. It echoes the exact same overwhelming multi-front approach the United States used at the very beginning. of this war back in February when the opening campaign struck more than 5,000 targets in its first days alone and damaged or destroyed 50 separate Iranian naval vessels within the first 10 days of fighting. That opening operation set the template for everything that followed. Overwhelming simultaneous force applied across the widest possible target set, designed to establish total dominance before Iran's own defensive and retaliatory networks could even fully organize a response. What we just watched happen in this most recent heavy wave is in many ways a smaller echo of that exact same original doctrine applied again 5 months later, specifically because a more limited, more restrained approach through the ceasefire and diplomatic period in between had clearly failed to stop Iran from continuing to threaten shipping and launch attacks against American forces and regional partners. That repetition itself tells a story. When negotiation and limited pressure failed to produce lasting change, both sides seemed to default back to the same playbook that worked, at least temporarily, the first time around. It suggests that despite 5 months of diplomacy, ceasefires, and quiet back-channel talks, neither Washington nor Tehran has actually found a new way to break this cycle. They keep reaching for the same tools because, so far, nothing else has managed to hold. So where does all of this actually leave us 6 months into a war that refuses to follow any predictable pattern? The honest picture is one of a conflict that has settled into a deeply unstable balance. Neither side is able to force a clean, decisive resolution. But neither side is willing to simply stand down either. The United States has clearly shown it retains the capability to launch strike packages twice the size of anything that came before, using only a single provocation as justification, hitting 5 provinces and 3 islands within a matter of hours. Iran, on the other hand, has shown it retains enough resilience even after absorbing that kind of overwhelming force to strike back against 2 separate neighboring countries within days. And running underneath all of that military exchange sits a genuine active diplomatic track, one apparently influential. Enough to cancel a planned follow-up strike based on direct appeals from Gulf allies and, according to Trump's own account, from Iran itself as well. That is the real story hiding underneath every headline about explosions and casualty counts. This is not simply a war of bombs and missiles anymore. It is a war of pressure and restraint, playing out simultaneously on the battlefield, in oil markets, and in quiet phone calls between world leaders, trying to keep an entire region from tipping over the edge. Every strike package sends a message not just to Iran, but to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, to Kuwait, and to every country whose economy depends on ships moving safely through the Strait of Hormuz. Think about the ripple effect for a second. A single night of strikes in southern Iran does not just affect people in Bushehr or on Qeshm Island. It affects shipping insurance rates for tankers crossing the Gulf. It affects fuel prices at a gas station thousands of miles away. It affects how nervous investors feel about markets that have nothing directly to do with this war on paper, but everything to do with it in practice. A war like this, one never stays contained to the region it is being fought in. It reaches into supply chains, into energy bills, into decisions being made in boardrooms that have never had anyone set foot anywhere near the Persian Gulf. And that is exactly what makes this moment so hard to predict and so important to actually understand rather than just skim past. 6 months in, this war has proven it can go quiet for 5 nights, and then explode across 5 provinces in a single one. It has proven that even its most devastating strikes still leave a door open for negotiation. And it has proven that the line between escalation and restraint in this conflict is thinner and far more fragile than most people watching from the outside ever realize. If there is one thing this latest wave of strikes should make painfully clear, it is this. Wars like this one rarely end with a single dramatic moment. They end, if they end at all, through 1,000 small decisions like the ones we just walked through. Together, what to hit, what to spare, when to strike, when to hold back. Every single one of those choices is being made right now in real time by people thousands of miles away from the families actually living through the consequences. So the next time you see a headline calling this war quiet, remember what quiet has actually meant so far in this conflict. It has meant 5 nights of held breath right before the largest single night of strikes this war has seen in months. That is the reality of where things stand right now, and it is exactly why the story is far from over. Before you go, think about this for a second. A war can look calm on the surface and still be one single missile away from its biggest escalation yet. That is the world this conflict has created, and it does not look like it is slowing down anytime soon. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what is happening instead of just reacting to headlines, do one thing before you leave. Share it with someone who keeps asking you what is actually going on in this war. Subscribe so you are here for whatever comes next. And I will see you in the next one.